Welcome, everybody, to our latest GM panel. My name is Brandy Camel. I am your community lead for Dungeons & Dragons, and I am so excited to be here. So, if this is your first time joining a DM panel, we get DMs from across our community to come together and talk about really cool topics, and hopefully we all walk away like having learned something and honestly just having fun. So, what we'll be talking about today, before we get started, I do have to call out that this is sponsored by our Virtual Play Weekend program. So, what are Virtual Play Weekends? Once a month, our partners at Baldman Games help us run hundreds of online Dungeons and Dragons sessions. So whether you're into Adventurers League and really want to continue that, or if you are a brand new player and you've never played D&D before, this is a great place to get started. They're online sessions, experienced DMs. There is a cost to entry, but all of the proceeds go directly to the organizers and the DMs who help put this program together. It is a totally non-for-profit organization. So check that out. We'll have a link in the description below, and we hope to see you at our next event. So what are we talking about today? We are going to tackle the 3 pillars of Dungeons and Dragons. So if you want to follow along, check Chapter 8 of the Dungeon Master's Guide. These are outlined there. They are social interaction, exploration, and combat. So let's talk to our DMs and get to know them before we hop into this. So if you can introduce yourselves to everybody and let them know which pillar you're going to be championing today, that would be lovely. We'll start with Satine.
Hi, I'm Satine Phoenix, and I'm a professional dungeon master, live streamer, and event planner. And today I'm going to talk about social interactions.
I'm Griffin McElroy, DM for the Adventure Zone, and I do other podcast stuff also. And I'm going to be talking about exploration, which, if you've listened to the Adventure Zone, you know is a topic we take very, very seriously.
I'm Mark Hulmes. My special thing is I'm British. No, I run a D&D show called HighRollers D&D with a bunch of my friends here in the UK. And today I'm going to be talking about combat, which is one of my favorite things in D&D. I have a little bit of experience of both nearly killing players and having lots of my monsters killed. So hopefully I can talk about that quite well. So, yeah.
Of course, while we have everybody focusing on an area of expertise, if you have something to toss into a topic or one of the questions we're talking about, don't be shy. Like, this is meant to be an open-ended kind of fun discussion between a bunch of awesome DMs. So we'll go ahead and get started. And I will jump from topic to topic so that we're kind of rotating through and everybody gets a chance to do stuff. So we'll start with social interaction. I love social interaction. A lot of times people are like, well, so social interaction is RP, right? That's role play. That's that side of the game. That's it. And there are times where maybe a group doesn't have a character in its party composition that's ideal for social interaction. They don't have a face. What advice would you give to that group in approaching social interactions and how they can kind of take those challenges on their group?
I like to offer opportunities to all the players in these kind of situations. You got one that is beefy, so that one might be intimidating. And when they interact with people, they're going to go in that direction. You've got your intelligence based characters, and maybe they're usually quiet, but if you offer them an opportunity that'll kind of like get them to use that intelligence in a social situation, they just go after it. So maybe they don't have a face, but you should put something there for everybody.
I don't think you need to tailor it for your group if nobody has a particularly beefy charisma score. Maybe they're just the party of adventurers who are like just really socially inept. Like they don't get the good deals and they don't like they rub people the wrong way and are unable to talk their way out of a fight. That's great. I think that's fantastic that you harness that power.
I'm like imagining the Bad Batch as a team.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. I think some of my favorite interactions are actually with characters that don't have high charisma scores, because they're often the ones where a crazy circumstance will come about. You know, the barbarians misunderstood and everybody thinks that they're trying to do something they're not, and you kind of create this crazy scenario from it. I think that those can sometimes be the more exciting encounters than somebody who's just succeeding at it,
because you don't want to make it easy for them. I don't like to make it easy for my players, so I want them to think around situations. And when there's a conflict, that's where the story happens, and that's where all the exciting things, especially on like our live streams, that's where people, like the audience and the players, all get engaged. They're like, oh no, how horrible could this go? And everyone leans in to figure it out.
The face is particularly interesting for like us, for people who make actual play shows, because it's inherently like not great programming to have like one of your players who does a lot of the speaking, especially in our podcast medium. So this new season we just started, one of the players is the face. They're a bard, and the other two I think both have a -1 charisma modifier. But I can't just let, like, it's a spoken word medium. We can't just have one person do all the talking. So it's all about, for us at least, like offering everybody opportunities, but understanding that only one of those people are going to be able to make anything out of those opportunities.
Yeah. I know one thing I try and do is if I notice that a character is not particularly involved in a scene, and I think it comes with knowing my players as well, that, you know, sometimes their character won't speak, but that doesn't mean they don't want to. I'll try and call it out. You know, the NPC, like the king or the queen, turns around and says, oh, well, what do you think about this? Blah, blah, blah. And you call out that character in particular, just to give them that opportunity, because sometimes it's that real life social awkwardness of they don't want to speak over somebody, or they don't want to interrupt somebody's game, but they've got that thing they want to do. And you know, that gives that character, whether or not they're a face, that opportunity to kind of speak forward, right?
Yeah, and on that line of thought, you know, all my NPCs have a reason for being there, but they also have character personalities. So maybe they don't want to talk to the face. They're actually wanting to talk to someone that is more like them. And so just by kind of reading the group, they're able to be like, yeah, that guy's actually pretty loud, but you're really quiet. I would rather talk to you because you seem to be more like me. Being able to offer that kind of allows that quiet person to shine even more.
Yeah, something I liked really early on that you mentioned was like focusing on the more intelligent side of a character if they're kind of present like that. Like you could be walking into a library and they're like, well, you know, I think I'm going to talk to the person who looks like they really know stuff in this group. Feeding into those things is an awesome tip for players to get them, coax them out of their RP Heidi shell that happens sometimes when they're like, oh, I don't have a high charisma. I guess that means I don't get to talk. Like,
No.
I've had people at my table like that, and I'm like, no, it doesn't have to be that way.
You don't get out of it that easy.
Right? Yeah,
Exactly.
we'll make you socialize. All right, let's move on to exploration. So exploration can mean a lot of things. I think this is actually probably one of the most broad topics of the 3 pillars, because this could mean you're going into a dungeon or roaming the wilderness or investigating a city. So what is your favorite type of exploration and why?
Yeah, it is. I joked earlier about, if you've listened to the Adventure Zone, you know about how we think about exploration, because it's not like we don't do a lot of it. We don't do it, or at least we don't focus on a lot of the travel part of exploration. We don't do the like going from point A to point B, or at least we haven't. That is integral to the season that we are currently doing, which is like an undersea exploration story. Like there's a lot of exploration in that one, but in the past it's exploration has meant to us like how much of the map that I, the DM, have drawn can they uncover, which is, it turns out, way more work for me to do it that way, and also not the most sort of like satisfying way to flesh out an adventure. I talk a lot about like sort of every DM, and in fact every game of D&D like is trying to fulfill a different kind of purpose. For us, it is a show that we are making, and so you know, we could not find a way, or couldn't think of a way, to sort of make exploration like plot critical in a way, or at the very least like enjoyable, which is a failing on our part and not the concept of exploration. And it's now sort of occurring to me, like as we've played a few episodes now of Ethersea, which is the new season, that we did ourselves a huge disservice, because there's a lot of stuff that fits very nicely into exploration that doesn't fit into plot critical stuff. A lot of character development can happen when the stakes are just a little bit lower with exploration stuff. And what I'm realizing also is like my favorite part about exploration is how it augments that plot critical stuff, how it can change it into something cooler or something more dangerous or something more rewarding. This season, we were inspired a lot. Last season, I played a wild magic sorcerer, and the wild magic table was so good, so much fun. Every time we rolled on it, it was an absolute blast. So I came up with 100 random encounters that they could encounter whenever they're out in the water, like exploring. And every time they leave the city, they roll a 1d100. They have a modifier based on like how well prepared they are, if they have information on where they're going, if they have supplies, and they can add that to their roll. And low rolls are super dangerous and high rolls can be super rewarding, but it has nothing to do with the job that they're currently on. But it's going to change it. It's going to change like what they are capable to accomplish later on. It is a third heat to playing D&D, and I feel genuinely quite foolish for neglecting it as long as we have, because it just hasn't really been a big thing for us.
You know, I think it's a valuable point that I think exploration is the one pillar that tends to get overlooked most frequently, because most people either think about, oh, well, roll for initiative, or, oh, I'm going to have this social interaction. Like, I think those are the things people innately turn to. But I'm actually also running a very exploration bound, like kind of early post-apocalyptic, like the world is happening. This is happening right now. We've got to start warning people. So there's a lot of travel in between places. And I had this light bulb moment where I rolled on a random encounter table and I was like, oh, it's a group of Pegasus. How am I like, it's my first instinct was, why would they want to fight these? And then the next question I asked was like, well, obviously they wouldn't. So how can I actually make this an exploration encounter or a social encounter instead of a combat encounter? Because that's where we go when we think of the word encounter. So.
Yeah. Yeah. When you think of random encounters, you think of, a bunch of goblins jumping out of the forest, or a bunch of, bandits or something like that. But I think like, especially in some of the more recent D&D modules and some of the stuff I've seen done, having these random encounters where it's not always a combat encounter, maybe it's, a traveling NPC, it's a beloved favorite, like the traveling merchant who's got like all these strange, bizarre trinkets that you can buy. That is always, loved because players, because it gives them something different. It's something that can expand the world. That's my favorite thing with exploration is, as somebody who loves world building, who loves creating history and story, that's your opportunity, not just through the social interaction, but through the exploration of the world, to kind of bring in elements of the players' stories and things that you think are really cool as a DM that you want to put into there. It's just such a great opportunity to do that. And doing that with non-combat encounters, perfect way to do it.
Yeah, I hate exposition, so I use exploration for that. So I unfold the world through them investigating it and just experiencing it, having to like get through it. I don't like to tell them everything at once, because your players almost always only absorb 10% of the information that you give them. So if you just dose that information throughout the game, and then in these type of encounters, they absorb so much more, because they're like, oh, baby step, baby step, baby step. And now they're expecting to look around and not just take things at face value, because you only, if you're going through your game, you're only talking, you're only explaining things for about a couple sentences, or to kind of keep things moving. So if you have a couple sentences here and then a couple there, that moves the flow is really nice that way.
Yeah.
Well, let's move on to combat. Combat is often kind of looked at let's toss the spotlight on you,
My
Mark.
very, very energetic combat pose.
So combat's often looked as kind of like the crunch part of tabletop, or of D&D in particular. So how do you transform, say you have a combat encounter, how do you transform a combat encounter into being a more role-play intensive experience and going beyond just what's on the dice?
Yeah, I think this is such a key thing. You see a lot of people talk about D&D combat and, ways to, maybe balance it, or it can be boring, or, whatever in that kind of regard. I love combat. I think combat is, it's the distillation of conflict. At the end of the day, it is the primary conflict you can have in a D&D game, and conflict is where narrative can come from. And I think that if you're running a combat, the first question you have to almost think of as a DM, this is what I think, what I do, is what are the stakes, right? Because if it's just 4 orcs in a 20 by 20 room in a dungeon that are just there, then it's not going to really be very role-playing. It's not going to be an encounter that has any importance to the game. If it's 4 orcs defending a shaman who's casting a ritual that's going to blight the hometown of one of the player characters, that combat immediately has way more impact. It's more interesting. There's opportunities for role play in there, and it just makes it much more exciting and interesting to the players as well. So if you're building from that idea of what are the stakes, what is at stake in this combat, and you take it away from the idea of just, well, the monsters are going to fight until they run out of hit points, and the players are going to try and stop themselves running out of hit points, that's the combat encounter. Then if you go and you start thinking about the objectives, not just of the players but of the monsters as well, what are the players trying to do? Are they trying to protect somebody? Are they trying to steal something? Are they trying to sneak by somewhere? What are the monsters trying to do? Are they trying to stop somebody from getting in somewhere? Are they trying to protect something? Are they after something? And I think that when we look at like the classic fantasy examples, you look at like the Lord of the Rings movies and things like that, each of those kind of main conflicts, when you look at them, they had objectives that weren't just have a fight because it's a fight. Right. There was the Uruk-hai trying to capture the hobbits. They're trying to protect Frodo from the goblins and the cave troll in the Mines of Moria, whatever it is. These objectives really add to the stakes, but also give that combat consequence. And I think that that's like a key factor for me for making it have more of that role-playing kind of vibe to it.
I also like the what was that game? Shadow of Mordor, the RPG where you could you would get in these fights and then maybe the enemy would walk away from it and come back later.
Yeah.
Waste with a metal plate on their head or some like wild armor. Now, I think, having different ending states for a fight is a way to not only bolster like the role playing of that session, but to like form the entire campaign potentially. If if there's an enemy that they keep running into, an enemy that they can't seem to pin down, because then it's a question of, well, we're not just going to dump our 6th level spells to try and blast this person. We need to
stop them.
We need to capture this person. Yeah. We need to. Yeah, exactly. Which is, it's a really, really fascinating sort of heat. A thing that's also important for us, again, doing like sort of a non-visual medium podcast, is we try to keep fights intimate, try to keep them fairly small. I never like having more enemies than there are players, which for Adventure Zone is 3.
Yep.
So I try to make those 3 enemies have like as much character as I possibly can. Which helps the players keep things straight, right? Yeah. It's not just like, oh, well, I attack the 3rd goblin. It's like I attack the trash can robot.
Yeah.
Like, you remember which one is the trash can robot. And that's good for the listeners, honestly, too, because
helps visualize.
Also asking them to stay engaged. Yeah. Right, exactly.
Yeah.
I really like showing my players that the enemy is more organized than they are. So they'll run into a scout, or they'll run into a patrol, and then they'll run into like a group of spies, and then they'll run into the general and their army. And throughout the game, especially with the Sirens, because they're all bards, they start to overthink everything, and they're like, oh my gosh. And then they start taking their time, and eventually they do one of my favorite things, where they start to plan for that and around it. And also allows, by staggering like who they interact with and when, especially like in one combat, I'll have 3 waves of people coming in and out, and they're just like, what is going on? But it shows them how powerful the big bad guy is, and they can't just walk into everything, because that person's thinking way ahead of them.
That's awesome. And I love how much that ties into both the world building side of things. It ties into exploration of like, okay, where did this guy run off to? Now we need to go track him down. Yeah. I mean, it's really wonderful when you can get these pillars to interact with each other, because it makes them all so much stronger.
Yeah, everyone
Um,
loves a big bad guy monologue and the players giving their little witty responses, and then they have a fight, and then the bad guy teleports away, and then they're shaking their fist in the air, and you end the session, and like everyone's like, "Ah, I can't believe you ended it there!" Like that's the most fun moments for me. Like when the players are on the edge of their seat, and you get those moments like that. That's the best.
that is definitely the best. Let's roll back to social interaction. Have you ever employed, so we talked about this kind of like we touched on it lightly in terms of, you don't have to be a charisma character to have a social interaction. So have you ever employed unusual, maybe non-charisma based skills in a social interaction? And what's the most memorable, or what was the result?
So I run a game of bards, and they're all in a band. It's called Sirens. This season's Song of Salvata, and Salvata, the city that I created, is a city of bards. So you've got bards who are all high charisma in a city of high charisma bards. I really had to twist it around and make the characters kind of, if they just go head to head with charisma, it's just going to be them knocking their heads. And the people who live there probably have higher charisma than they do. So I've been able to use their other abilities, because often, I think half of them are multi-classed. So I've allowed them to use other abilities to interact with the NPCs. And by doing that, it's almost like they've created a bigger puzzle than I could have created for them, and using their wiles in different ways. We have our like acrobat, dexterity based bard who is a dancer, and so she'll be a little more coy about things, and that entices the other NPCs and some of the other characters sometimes. Where you've got your like wizard bard who's so intellectual, and I love, this is like one of my favorite ones, my geometry bard, who's like really goes in and intellectualizes and can get into a logical debate with NPCs. So if you look at it that way, suddenly you're like, for me in social interactions, kind of like what Mark was saying, giving everybody a need in a scene is really important. I study script writing. I love script writing for comics and TV. You only have a very short amount of time in each scene, so you kind of have to amplify those things. So being able to address non-charisma based skills to have them get what they want, and get them fast, and get the people to react, and also I try to get them to not lean into combat in those social situations where they actually have to negotiate and intellectualize their way around it. Like it's so much fun. It's really fun.
Yeah, I mean, you can do competition in like so many different ways, and it doesn't have to be sort of charisma based. Like our first season, Travis played a fighter, and so like when all you've got is a hammer, and so anytime he couldn't quite pull off that intimidation check, he would just like, "You want to arm wrestle?" And then that was the way that we got through the thing. So like, I don't know, that can be an incredibly powerful, overpowered tool for players if you let them get away with it too much. But
Yeah, I love I guess it's not so much social interaction, but the idea of using skills to accomplish tasks, whether that's through social interaction like having a dialogue, or I'm a big fan of skill challenges from previous editions of D&D, and I kind of tweak them for 5th edition, maybe making them a bit less rigid, but kind of just allowing players the idea of you have to get a certain number of successes before a certain number of failures, and how that framework can apply. You have to try and convince the bishop that you're here to help the church before the evil deacon convinces him that you're actually bad and is going to get you thrown out, right? And so that's representing the successes and failures. For HighRollers, my players know me notoriously for doing this. It will be things like magical rituals, where you've got to bring it. And so, you think of a magical ritual in the same way that, if you have like a bunch of bards trying to have a charisma contest, a magical ritual, only the magical characters can, interact. Not necessarily like you can have, giant mithril chains that the barbarian is having to hold tight so that the mages can channel energy through them and things like that. You can basically turn anything into a skill check that's going to benefit in some way, because you want everybody to be involved. And that means that everybody's kind of working together. And my favorite thing is when they look at the sheet and they're like, right, what can I use to do something cool? And then they do the cool thing, and then that creates an interesting scenario for the group. And even better when they fail at those things, those big epic things, and it leads to great, awesome new scenes. But yeah, I think that, that whole idea of like trying to find new skills to use around, and things like tools like a skill challenge or clocks is another kind of mechanic style that you can use with stuff like that. Is very good as well.
I think one of my favorites at a convention, I do this open mic night game. I play it everywhere. And there was a barbarian who wanted to be a roadie, but then they had to perform on stage, but not everyone was a bard. And this guy's like, I don't know how to do it, but I want to participate. So he got up on the drums, and we used athletics for him to just like taiko drum the drums. And he was so excited to participate with the group. So by finding those things so they can all work together, everyone can kind of, if the group knows each other, I like to let them offer suggestions, like where I'm like, okay, well, this is a performance thing. They're like, well, I'm really bad, but I could do this and participate this way, or that person can do this. Why don't they do that? And work together that way. It makes it so much fun.
Yeah, I think it's really important to remind, especially new players, or people who have just never played a tabletop RPG before. It's like, just because I've asked for this thing, just because I've asked for a performance check, just because I've asked for a survival check, just because I said that word doesn't mean that that's the only thing that goes. Like, be flexible. Right. You can maybe adapt something. How can your character apply to this situation?
And sometimes it doesn't even need to be that skill is going to be the success or failure, but if they succeed on that check, maybe that's a huge boost to another player who's going to do something else. Like, by doing this, you've actually enabled this person to, get a huge bonus, or maybe try again. That's one thing I love to do as well, is like using those other skills lets you try again at a thing you've already failed. And that can be a great way for people to feel that they've contributed without necessarily doing the thing that you've asked for,
Yeah, or like last night's game, I have this one show on Facebook called Maze on Planet 7. They just roll really bad, like they're really terrible at it. And so one person tried to do something, they couldn't do it, and then I like to let them react by helping the other person. And it was like 3 failures back to back. Somebody had a luck point that they gave another person, and that failed even worse. And I'm like, yes.
Yeah, inspiration is such a great tool to use in that space, because it's like, okay, well, we'll get somewhere. So eventually someone will get somewhere. Or even a failure is, what gets you to that next stage that is, okay, this is a new challenge to take on. So on the exploration side of things, I have a feeling I know the answer to this question because you come from the podcast universe. But when you're running exploration, do you prefer to have visual representation, or do you prefer leaning into theater of the mind?
So it's honestly, it depends on like what season we were doing and what the sort of nature of the exploration was. We've done a season, using digital tools. We used Roll20, and the setting for that season was super important. And so it was important for the players to at least have a sort of understanding of spatial relationships, if not like what everything looked exactly like. And without having we've never played on a grid on the Adventure Zone. We've never had like a map that we put pieces down on, because we've never recorded the show in person, except for live shows, which is not conducive to anything we're talking about today. So for us, it is sort of all theater of the mind by necessity, because our listeners can't, unless they like go visit our website later and see the maps with alt text that we put up. They're not going to get any of that. So we have to be and that was something that we heard on the season that we had, that was sort of maps intensive, was a lot of like, you all keep mentioning this one, this one Pizza Hut in this town, like, but I don't know where that is. So it got a little frustrating for the fans. So that's really the extent of what I want to use it for, is to help the players understand where things are, rather than like how they can interact with the world, because I want to leave that up to them, and I want to leave like specific descriptions of things up to them. I just don't want them to say like, okay, well, I rush from the doctor's office to the saloon, and it's like, well, those are 2.5 hours away from each other.
Yeah.
It's a very rushed 2.5 hours.
Yeah, sure. The season we're doing doesn't have a saloon or doctor's office in it. I don't know where I got those two. I was like my brain was like, what are two buildings? Think of any two buildings.
Doctor's office, saloon.
Uh-huh.
Those are definitely the two I have top of mind all the time.
You can tell, and now you understand why improvisational exploration has not been our strong suit.
Yeah, I find that maps and visual items can hinder sometimes in my games, because so for Roll20, for instance, if I leave them on a screen for too long, they fixate on that and they start losing their imaginations. But if I narratively explain what the thing looks like, they're like, oh, I'm in a tavern, there's a chandelier and a rope. I'm going to pull this chandelier, I'm going to swing from the rope onto the chandelier and then do other stuff with curtains. Or there's a turkey leg on the table. But if I put them on a map that they can see, and there's no turkey leg, then there is no turkey leg. And if if I don't populate it with people, then there are no people on the scene.
Yeah.
So I try to use that very minimally and only if I have to.
Yeah, it's a real, I feel like, theater of the mind, and having like gridded maps or, kind of tiles or whatever it is. It's a real double-edged sword, because exactly like Satine says, like, people will fixate on what's there. Whereas in theater of the mind, the kind of con of theater of the mind is sometimes you get that like, wait, hang on, what's in this room again? Okay, where's this guy now? What was going on with that? Like, people can get kind of lost. Not everybody can visualize in the same way. That's one thing with our group, is like, we've got people who all visualize at different levels. So some people really struggle when they can't physically see the map. Some people hate the map and they much prefer it just to kind of come up in their minds and things like that. I find the things like, especially with exploration as well, I look back and I don't think I've ever really done it justice. I've always been way too ambitious with like campaign maps where I'm going to draw out this whole continent, puts one city and like 3 villages, and then it's like, oh no, what else do I put in here? And so that's like one thing I definitely want to try and improve on. But I have always loved looking back at like things like the old hex crawls, where there's this giant hex map and like there's this big list of cool stuff that can happen and you can track, a number of I kind of love that stuff, even though it's a little bit clunky and a little bit mechanical. I think that it can create interesting scenarios that otherwise you don't get, especially in games that take place in like one location for a long time. You can kind of sometimes miss out on some of that eclectic randomness of the travel. And so I kind of want to find that sweet spot that balances the two, where you've kind of got a little bit of this and a little bit of that, but you can still jump between the two, or, make sure you remind the players like, hey, I know that this is the map, but, if you guys think that there's something cool here, go for it. Like, you tell me, is there a chandelier here? Yeah, sure, of course there is. You swing on it, kind of thing. Trying to find that balance.
The conversation, it's so funny. We've been in quarantine for so long, but this conversation we're having is almost a virtual conversation. But when we're at the table, visual elements at the table, like I have this massive collection of Dwarven Forge. When it's down on the table, it can be very intricate or empty or just like paper. People don't fixate it on it the same way as if it's on the screen. And I think it's their visual, what's that called? The outside of your vision. Somebody in here. Periphery. Thank you. Because it's down here and all the faces are here, everyone connects with the eyes, right? But if it's all up here, it gets very confusing to people. So there's actually like all these game master tip conversations we're having. It's almost like we have to remember that people are going to start going back, and what is the flip side of all of it?
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say there's an exception to sort of what we've been talking about, and that's if you use a map as a sort of as a log, rather than like a from a macro level, like you're not just like, here's the map and you can choose where to go. It's like if we during a scene decide that there's some there's some enchanted kelp forest over here, like cool, let's add it to the map.
I love that.
The season we did where that took place in sort of a rural city, a rural town in West Virginia, had a lot of empty stuff on it. Like it was actually a screenshot of a Google map of a town in West Virginia that I just went through and meticulously erased all of the like street names and building names and stuff like that. And then anytime like we came up with a thing that was in this town, we would just add it to that map. And then it all of a sudden it wasn't like a thing they were using for gameplay purposes so much, but it was like a way of all of us knowing kind of what was in our world. And if you needed to improvise something or tap some story beat or character, having that map in front of us was invaluable.
That's cool. I love that.
It's really interesting from my perspective, because I don't really do the live show stuff like all of you do, like the doing live streams or on stage, but I've done a lot of like at convention play, where I find that having those physical representations is almost mandatory, because you get a lot of new players or a lot of people who don't quite grasp what D&D is, and they're like, well, is it a board game? Is it, what is it? So it's helpful on one side, but I can also see where it can be hindering, especially in that virtual space. I really like that you touched on that, Satine, because I think that's true. I think that we're overly fixated on the things that we have on our screens, because we've lost that other engagement point. So
I miss playing at a table immensely.
We have a table that we hand built downstairs that's like all dusty and sad, and I'm like,
oh no.
So, soon.
Drawers full of Dwarven Forge and miniatures just sat unloved.
It's this
just
entire wall. You can't see it here, but it's like they're just stacked on top of each other. And we do have a game coming up, an in-person game on the 31st. And I'm nervous.
It's been forever since I've actually had like a in-person game that I've played. And in some ways that's good, because I know if I started running one for my friends here in Austin, I would spend literal thousands of dollars on Dwarven Forge, like maps and foam core taverns and stuff like that. It's I could see that being something I would get way too into.
I definitely don't miss the DM hands, though. The like strip of ink that you have from drawing.
Strip of ink or like paint covered hands from painting miniatures and resin. I always call it, I always refer to it when I got back into miniature wargaming. When I was a kid, you would dream of all these things like, oh, I want to have this amazing table full of miniatures and terrain and all this stuff, and you would dream of it and you would make stuff out of things. But now I have a thing called adult money, and adult money can easily be spent on toys and things that have no real purpose other than being beautiful tables and for your friends to plink little goblins around. And it's dangerous. It's very dangerous.
I also have children, including a 4-year-old who dug up in a closet of ours like an antique copy of a competing fantasy adventure game from like the 90s that rhymes with zero best. And I'd like maintained this thing for my entire life, because we played that game a lot when we were kids, and he found all the miniatures inside and all the little map making parts. And man, they were not long for this world.
Oh, bless.
He broke my barbarian sword.
Oh,
what do we even do? I know.
I think I actually have some Ziploc bags of some of those laying around as well that a friend gifted to me, because he's like, well, I've lost half the other set, so I guess you can have the remainder.
You might as well have it.
Might as well have it.
Amazing.
So combat. I think we touched on this really lightly, but combat can be the place where players tend to get caught up into the rules most frequently when it comes to combat. So what is your advice on keeping combat flowing if or when there's a rules question? And this can go for either like at a casual table or on stream.
Yeah, I mean, I think I can, from where I've played it, both with friends off stream. I played for most of my life without doing this as for streaming and things like that. And then since moving to streaming, I've always tried to keep the same attitude towards that, which is in the moment, I'll make it, well, in the moment, you make a decision in the player's favor. So if a player's like, I think this means this and that I get this bonus. In the moment, I'm like, okay, yeah, sure. I'll check it later and then we'll correct it for the next time. And then you, whether it's during a break or at the end of the session, I'll go and check the rule, look online, see if there's like an FAQ or, read through it again. And then I'll just tell the player and say, hey, I read that rule. I actually think this works this way now that I've read it properly. From now on, this is how I'd like to do it. And then you also have a conversation and say, do you guys think that's fair? Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that's okay. The other thing I do is whenever there's a rule like that, or if I do a custom homebrew rule, I do quite a lot of those for HighRollers, the game, the live stream that I do. Like I have a custom crit rule, which is you maximize the damage instead of just rolling another dice on top of it. I always do the same thing, which is like this. Yep, that rule applies for you guys, as long as it's okay for me to use that against you at the same time. And like, as long as there's that equality in the table where they're like, yeah, that sounds fair. I'm like, okay, great. Then that works out quite well. And it's the same way with like a rules question. Like, if the players think that it should be one thing, I'm like, okay, yeah, that's fine. As long as you're okay with me doing the same thing if the monsters get it, or if this comes up, or if I use that spell. And I think that that's the best way to do it. You want to keep that momentum going. If you stop to look up in the books and people are now on their phone and they're getting distracted or they're like getting snacks, it can really disrupt that flow. And combat in D&D can sometimes be really a slugfest, so it's one of those things you want to kind of keep moving. So making that decision in the player's favor in the moment and then checking it back later has always been like my preferred way of doing it. Obviously, that's just my way of doing it, but yeah, that's how I always try to approach it. And I think that works quite well both for streaming and for offline games as well, because on a stream, you've got people watching, you want to keep the thing progressing, but at home, you don't want to suck people out of the moment. You don't want people to suddenly not care about the fact that the cleric's on 0 hit points and the evil lich is about to kill their friend. If suddenly you're like, hang on, guys, I just need to look up how Finger of Death works, and then everyone's on their phone and like everyone, like, it kind of takes away all the drama, right? So you want to kind of keep that going too.
Yeah.
I started doing a funny thing with my players. I have all their character sheets on D&D Beyond up. So whenever they cast something, I check it immediately. And I used to be all paper and pencil, but I've leaned in. I'm completely digital now. And it's sped up my time to look at what they're doing and check the rules first.
Yes.
So I have like my Dungeon Master screen and then my own built-in Dungeon Master screen with hyperlinks. But the funniest thing is when a player is excited that they know a rule, but I've changed it because I want them to win in this scene, because I will be really hard on them with rules in a different scene. And so they'll be like, but actually it's supposed to be like this. I'm like, are you sure that is what you want to say right now? And they're like, oh, yes. And I'm like, okay, I guess this is what happens versus what could have happened. But now that they've seen that I do that, and as long as you're consistent in how you're handling rules, the players, if you get to play with them a lot, will start to read you like you read them. And now they're like, oh, she's doing that thing again. We got triple advantage. Like, don't question it.
Yeah. I think that's like a big factor as well, is that I don't play. I play with the same group of people I've been playing with the same group of people for the last 5 years, and before that, it was the same colleagues at work for 3 years. Like, whereas if you're in like a game store, an adventurers league, where you're maybe playing with a different group each week, you might not be able to have that level of trust, right? Where you can kind of do all these kind of things. But when you've got that trust with the group, I find that you can easily, those sorts of things become less of a thing, where you can just be like, hey, this is how it's going to work for this time. We'll talk about it later, kind of thing. They're like, hey, okay, yeah, and then they kind of go with it, right?
I think every DM implements the rule of cool to some degree. It's just like a question of like how seriously they exactly, yeah. And that changes, for us. Like if we're just recording an episode and my dad is like, okay, well, I freeze the whole ocean, and I'm like, no, you don't.
Yeah.
But if we're doing a live show and we want like big stupid things to happen that the audience is going to clap and laugh at, like I might say, okay, roll, and we'll see if you freeze the whole ocean. Oh, okay, wow, all right, let's resolve that.
Climate change, everybody.
Yes, very dramatic.
Yeah.
It's interesting because I've definitely been on both sides of the screen on this one, where especially because I did a lot of organized play early on in my career and working with wizards. I had to be the knowledgeable rules person. I was running stuff at Gen Con for 12 hours a day. I needed to be able to fire these off, breaking my back carrying around 30 books with me just to make sure I had all the references I needed. But like that's the necessity of that particular place, right? And a lot of that all comes back to something that we talked about a lot in the last DM panel, which is the social contract and session zeroing, right? Like setting that expectation with your players of this is how rules disputes will be handled. This is how, and like for Adventurers League, that's already been done for you. There's a document that outlines that, like that's how it's going to go at the table. You don't have to have that discussion. But for everybody else, I think it is important to set those boundaries and be like, all right, this is how we're going to handle this going forward.
Yeah. This is how I'd like to do it. What do you guys think? Let's have a talk about it and move forward.
Yeah. Perfect.
Cool.
So, back to social interaction. What do you think are the most important details to focus on when you are presenting your table with an engaging social interaction? Is there a particular thing that you hone in on when you're introducing a new NPC or just presenting players with a social challenge?
So they have to know, and for me, they have to know what the room looks like or the area that they're in. They need to know what like the temperature, weather, time of year kind of thing is. And then for me, they have to know what the character looks like and what their demeanor is. I also add in fidgety things, things that are like secondary. So there's the front, and then maybe this person's strong, but they're fiddling with their fingers a little bit, depending on their passive perception. So that's like the first layer of what I try to develop. And then there's the need. You got to have that need. What do they need? And then also dialogue. How much are they willing to interact with your players? Because like you're playing everybody else. You're playing the world. So it's good to understand who is invested in them and who's not invested in them, who wants more out of them than they're willing to give, and who's willing to strike deals. So like really understanding the characters. You can just roll this on charts and it's really easy, but I like to make things more complicated and really bring these characters to life for the social interactions. And then also knowing the players, I like to have unbalanced parties. Remove the cleric, remove your barbarian or something, so you have things. Or remove the bard who likes to talk, and then put elements in the room that each one of them, like each one of those players, might be able to be attracted to use in the scene. Because it's never just like person versus person. It's situation versus your characters. And then if I also don't like it when they kind of like just succeed over everything, so I'll also put in other elements to make the scene juicy, just to make it interesting. Last night they had to talk to these gargoyles, and then Ma just stone shaped the gargoyles. So now they were left with these two giant 8-foot balls, and there's a burning city behind them. They had to get in front of them. And so this social interaction turned into this other puzzle that they just kept failing their rolls on, and they ended up killing a bunch of people. But like even that was something, and all the people behind them are now looking at them. The world around them is alive, and then they realized the door was unlocked the whole time, and it was really interesting. But watching it unfold, I could have just let them walk into the door, but I had to give them something else, because for me, all of my scenes, so I actually script out my adventures and I put time codes on them. So I know that if I want this scene to be really interesting, I have to, like, this is going to be like a 10, 15, 20-minute scene. And it's important that I hit these beats, but allow the players to feel what's happening in the scene. Because if they're just talking back and forth, they won't be invested. But if they start having emotions about the things around them, then they're invested, and then they start giving more, and now I'm playing with my players.
I like to just, again, keeping things very simple as much as and keeping things so that you can keep them in mind when listening to if you binge listen to our podcast, like I can't throw too much stuff at you, or else it's too much to kind of remember. I like to just give characters that I know they're going to talk to like one thing, like one gimmick, like and it could be something as simple as like, this dude's pants are out of sight. And then I mean, the first NPC we introduced in the first season was a guy named Barry Blue Jeans, who just like wore a white shirt and blue jeans in Fandolin, essentially. So that was how we introduced him. But then also remaining like consistent with that character, so that the next time they have to find beloved blue jeans retailer, like they know who to go to, they know who to talk to first. It's which again, like if we were doing it in person and we could do a 3-hour session, and not worry about folks not playing the game, keeping track of it, like I could go a lot deeper with those NPCs, but by necessity I try to keep things simple.
I think that like on a basic level, for an interesting social or an interesting NPC, a cool visual element like Barry Blue Jeans, he's wearing blue jeans. That's like a thing. Players will remember that. They'll just be like, there was a blue jeans guy. Let's go speak to him. Like they'll stick in their mind. Or the tiefling with one horn, or the turtle that's got loads of swords stuck in his back. They'll remember that. That will always stick out in their heads. And then combined with what Satine said, for me, it's like give them a cool visual gimmick and then a strong goal. Like that NPC wants something. They don't just live to exist in the player's world. They have something they want. And that most often will tie in with what the players are trying to do. Maybe they're an opposition, maybe they're a potential ally because their goals align, but they have something they want. And then my favorite thing is I always add in something that they're either afraid of or like a secret that they have. Because then that way that gives like something the players like, especially when you get paranoid players and you start hinting that there's something that this NPC's not saying, they'll just be like, oh god, give me that secret, give me that thing that's not being revealed. And that could be a nice moment where you can reveal this NPC's terribly afraid of tieflings because their family was killed by them or something like that, and then that explains it. And then again, that's adding to the world building, that's adding to the world that you're creating around it. But like literally those three things, which can just be like one word or a short sentence, really makes the difference. I think that like if you just do that for like a couple of key NPCs, like if you're building out a town or a college or something like that, and you come up with sort of 3 or 4 NPCs with just like those 3 little things, a visual, a goal, and a fear or a secret, players will like really stick onto that. And like audiences as well will be like, oh, well, what's I want to know about this guy. I think that's like been a thing that I've like, this has really helped me as a DM.
It's always good to just build a basic framework that you can then launch off of, especially if it becomes a recurring character or it becomes a recurring villain, whichever.
You can build it on and add more stuff. Yeah.
Awesome. So I think I lost my place real quick. Where was I at? Oh, right. Okay. So exploration. So Griffin, you had mentioned that like in your current season, this has become more important. And in past seasons, it really hasn't been something that you've tended to. So I'm really interested in this one in particular. So let's say the party has a long trek ahead of them. It's going to be several days. Do you prefer to fast forward through lengthy travel times like that? Or do you want to soak in it? And if you do, how do you make that time engaging?
Yeah, it's weird because we're talking about a purely mechanical distinction at that point, because it's like, if you do one scene, one roll on the encounter table, and you say, well, that was the 1 hour journey that you took. And then you also maybe you do 2 rolls on the encounter table if it's a longer journey. Like, I think that is certainly one way of doing it. But for me, I think if a trip is particularly long and particularly arduous, think about it how you think about long trips in your own life, where I moved from Chicago down here to Austin, and like I remember that trip quite well because I loaded all of my crap up into a Toyota Matrix and then drove it 1 billion miles, and so that journey is memorable to me because of how challenging it was. And in D&D, you can make challenging potentially life-threatening, right? So make it threatening, make travel threatening. You don't have to. We never got in the weeds of like rations and, you know, do you have oil for your lanterns, which is some people's jam, and it just wasn't really our jam. But if you offer your players like a long journey through the desert to potentially find great riches on the other side, you need to make it entirely possible that they could die in the desert because they never got there and they didn't, you know, have a way to get back. It's just a question of like, what's cool? Like, what are your players going to like? Yeah. Don't just, I would advise against just making a long journey a series of like filler. Well, this trip is long, so they have to have a lot of different random events that happen to them along the way. Because that would get like, that's just the tedious part of the journey, not the like fun, scary, dangerous part of the journey. So, you know, make that as much a part of the arc as the big boss at the end, because I you know, think back to time before plane travel or car travel, like moving across the country or going any extended length of time is dangerous stuff. That said, we almost always skipped it in the first season. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, I think like whenever I know with our group in our first sort of like long campaign, I would skip over long travel because it was always something that growing up, my D&D group, we were just like, nah, nobody cares about this. Nobody wants to track rations and arrows and things. I personally love that stuff. Like, I'd love to play in a campaign where I've got to track all my rations and my gear and stuff. I kind of love that. But one of the things that I've kind of taken into with the stream games I do now, one of the first things I did in our current campaign for HighRollers was I gave the players an airship, because it just made like, we've got to go from point A to point B, but interesting stuff can still happen. And now I've given them a thing that they care about. Like, it's not just like the how do we get there and, you know, we've got to buy rations. It's like, oh, but what if the airship gets attacked? What if, you know, pirates attack? Or what if there's somebody snuck on board or something like that? You can kind of give them like interesting things to happen. But another thing I've started to do now is think of a journey in waypoints. So if a journey is going to be a really long time, maybe set aside and be like, right, this journey is going to take, you know, maybe it's going to take 10 days. I'm going to have the waypoints of these key locations that are on the journey, right? There's the Library of Candlekeep, there's Baldur's Gate, then there's Neverwinter. And like, those are the kind of key cities that they're going to stop off in to get supplies, to resupply, do all that stuff. And that's where you can have super exciting things happen, or you can have disasters, or you can have these moments kind of take by, and that kind of stops you having to do the whole like rolling every day for like a random encounter and stuff like that. You can kind of split the journey down into those waypoints, and then it just becomes like a thing that you know, just takes place. You know, you can kind of set up specific things that are going to happen. That's kind of how I've always ended up doing it. As much as I would love to try the sort of more you know, route by route, hex by hex. Oh, gotta mark off 4 rations for today. As much as I would love to do that, I've not done it yet.
Well, I was the same. I was like, oh, just skip over it. And then Tomb of Annihilation came out. And I'm Filipino. I was born in the jungle. It's dangerous. And then now I'm in Chult. I'm like, oh man, super dangerous. Just all these crazy, you know, ancient temples and stuff. But getting there, it was so exciting to me to play through Tomb of Annihilation, because you're like, it's dangerous. How dangerous could it be? You could get caught in a mudslide and you could lose all of your stuff. It was so much fun to bring the jungle to life. And now I do that in everything. And I think in the Icewind Dale game, there was like the avalanches and all the snow. And I'm just like, bring it, you know, and maybe it's not you going into combat with animals or, you know, bandits. It's you versus nature. Now, I'm a backpacker camper. I've done like, you know, 5 days in Yosemite, very long distances. It's dangerous. It's scary. You could freeze at night. And I love to bring that into the game. But it has to have a purpose, like you guys are saying. Like, why would you do that to your players? Well, you do it because you want them to kind of like build the character. This whole thing, Dungeons and Dragons, is the hero's journey. So what can you do in those instances where they get to that point, but they feel stronger, they're more bonded because they've survived, and now whatever they have to do at that location they were trying to get to, they're like, oh, we got this. We went 5 days, on route here. We got this.
That's the thing that's super interesting for me is I've done a lot of campaigns where there's the suggestion of it. So I do a lot. I tend to run a lot of pre-written stuff, mostly because I don't have the time to write for myself anymore. But I've come across a lot of pre-written things from other companies, from even sometimes in our company, where there are the suggestion of exploration, but not really the instruction or what to do within that space. And so you do have to ask yourself a lot of those questions. What part of this exploration is important? What part will be engaging to my players? What part will they actually find interesting? Is it worthwhile doing this? So sometimes there are portions of it that are worth skipping. Like there was a desert adventure I ran where it was like, you have to cross the desert, but you're also like 13th level. So why are you not just teleporting or flying? So like there were things like that where it's like, is this necessary? And the answer most of the time was no. But right now I'm running one where there's 6th or 7th level and they don't have those fast travel capabilities. And it is post-apocalyptic. And yeah, you want to pick up everything you have on the road because there's no one to buy arrows from. You better be making your own.
I love that stuff. And that's another funny thing is like, especially with D&D, when you get into high level and the group has teleport circle or teleportation or plane shift, a lot of these problems of exploration do just kind of go out the window. I mean, you can kind of substitute it with more planar events or, teleportation mishaps and things like that, but the systems itself is baked in. One thing actually Satine mentioned, you mentioned that with Tomb of Annihilation, like the idea of like you can lose your stuff. And I think that that's actually something which is sometimes overlooked, is that the consequences of these explorations and travels, it doesn't just have to be a monster and hit points. Like losing gear or, becoming lost or things like that, or losing companions like an NPC guide has so much dramatic impact and has so much in-game fun attached to it, and like, consequence and disaster that can really drive a cool game point forward. Like, if the fighter who's been carrying his or her family ancestral weapon for generations loses it in, an avalanche in Icewind Dale, that's a huge thing for that character, and it can spawn a whole new thing. And that's something that I think a lot of people don't always necessarily think of, is that, consequence doesn't have to just be lost hit points or exhaustion levels. It can be this kind of stuff as well, like losing gear and, losing companions and stuff like that as well. Especially people that get attached to their mounts. That's a real kick in the pants. That's a way to really hurt the players. Desperately so.
My group has a donkey right now pulling their cart, and they're like, but what's going to happen to the donkey? We know something bad's going to happen.
Look, it can just be like poor old Bill in Lord of the Rings. They just send him home. They just get to the shore, and they're like, okay, Bill, off you go. I'm sure you'll be fine.
All right, we've got our last question because we are running low on time now, but we'll end on this one that I think is kind of fun, and I think everybody has the opportunity to chip in on. But let's talk about combat encounters and where you go when you're designing them. So take us through kind of what your thought process is. What questions do you ask yourself, and do you have any favorite tools that help you along with that?
Yeah, I do. So the way that I tend to do it is I kind of break it down into a series of questions. Like whenever I do DMing stuff, everything is built around questions. I ask myself a bunch of questions. And with combat encounters, it's the first question is, why is this combat happening? There has to be a reason for it. Like, and that kind of connects to the stakes, that connects to the enemies and the player's objectives. I think that a lot of old school, and this is a total fine way to play D&D. There's a lot of just, there's monsters in the dungeon, you're going to fight them because they're in the dungeon. And that's totally fine if people want to play that way, but my group and the way that I like to play is I'd like to have reasons. Those guards are protecting this evil cult leader because they've done something, or there's a reason that they're doing it. Once you've got that in place, I then try and move on to a couple of other things. Environment, I ask myself, where is the fight taking place and why is it interesting? What's interesting about it? We've all played video games. When you play a video game level and you see red barrels, you shoot the red barrels because they make an explosion and it's fun, right? Or like, you know, if there's like crazy platforms that you can jump around on, people will, because they want to be engaged. And I kind of engagement and environment go hand in hand for me. You know, what makes the combat engaging? What's going to make the players excited about this combat? And environment's a huge one in that. I think things like lair actions are a huge benefit. They can really like spice things up. I like to make my battles dynamic, so at some point will change in the battle, whether that's the environment or the enemies or the objective. Something will change that will spin the battle on its head, and that keeps players very, very engaged. And then the kind of tying into the engagement thing is what mechanics can I put in this that is going to make it stand out? I love things like looking at video game bosses, MMO raids, to look at mechanics that you can bring into D&D that's going to, again, not just be hit the monster until its hit points run out. You know, one of my, I think in our latest campaign for HighRollers, I've done a lot of very kind of almost puzzle-like combats where, you know, the enemy will be protected by some sort of spell and they've got to charge up an orb by luring minions to a certain ritual circle, and if they kill the minions on the ritual circle, it charges the orb, and then they put the orb in the special hoop, and then the hoop delivers a thing that disables the shield for a couple of rounds. They do damage, and then, oh no, the shield's back up again, and then that, like, they get a kick out of that, and it's because they're video game players, but also it means that all of those abilities that aren't just hit the monster and do damage come into play. I've got a player who loves to use teleport spells. All of her spells are around like jumping through portals and teleporting. So any kind of environment where she gets to bamf around and grab these objectives and bring them to a thing makes her feel like a super cool badass. But then I have a barbarian player who just wants to hit things and do as much damage as possible. And so I want to make sure that they're still feeling super cool and that they're feeling engaged and challenged as well. So it's kind of combining all of those things together. And then I kind of round it off with one last question, which is what do the players get out of this? That could be treasure and could be loot, but it can also be information. It could be a cool part of their backstory gets brought into the campaign. It could be that a cool piece of plot gets revealed. Just making sure that there's something to every fight that makes them go, cool, that was worth doing. That was worth us getting something out of. And I think that that's kind of like my little step-by-step progress for combat. One of the big tools that I've really used, and I don't think I could ever go back to not having it, is the D&D Beyond combat encounter builder. Like, that thing is so good.
Just used it for the first time yesterday during a recording of Taz, and I was like, what have I been doing?
It's just initiative. You click on it, there's the stats. You can now roll straight from it as well. I'm just like, oh my god, I don't have to ever copy out a monster stat block in my life ever again. It's just there. I love it.
Yeah.
And almost any enemy has interesting things they can do beyond swiping their claws at you, and it's so much easier to leverage that stuff when you have it like right in front of you. We've been using D&D Beyond for a while, but for whatever reason we hadn't started using the encounter builder.
Yeah.
But now it seems it's good stuff.
Good stuff. As actually just another quick thing as well, Griffin pointed out, like the idea that monsters have different abilities. That's one thing I try and use. I use all the time now. Legendary actions and reactions and lair actions.
Mm-hmm.
I honestly think if you're a GM and you're having the players go against a single enemy or maybe just two enemies and the players outnumber them, give them legendary actions. Even if they're not a super powerful monster, give them like cool reactions or give them maybe just one legendary action. Not only does it balance out the action economy, but it makes that foe more interesting for the players to fight against, because there's an element of unpredictability, like, are they going to use this power now? Are they going to use it later? And if you combine that with things like the environment shifting around, the players then start to go, hang on, we know that statue is going to turn around and breathe fire in this direction. So if I'm going to have my fighter run over here and I'm going to taunt the bad guy, hey, come and get me. I'm over here. Come on, do it. Come kill me. And then the bad guy gets there and gets flamed on. They feel so cool because they're just like, I got you, DM, like, I figured it out. And then you're there just like a proud parent, like, you got me. You got me. I love that.
Yes, everything Mark said was perfect. Everything he said was perfect.
Yeah. I mean, I especially love the points that both Griffin and Mark dug into like do things that aren't just attacks. Like I mess around with the environment, do things that other people might not expect. It especially helps with knowledgeable players. If it's somebody who is also like a prolific DM and they spend their time reading the monster manual in their spare time, I'm totally calling my husband out right now. Like it's great to be able to have those tools in your back pocket to change things up and throw something that they're not expecting in, because they couldn't have read it in a book if they tried.
Yeah.
Oh, even further, I love resource management so much. And so I'll design the arc of my campaign. So I'll do like a season, and then like every 3 episodes, I've got this whole emotional thing that happens. So I know that and I never let them rest. I'm like, nobody gets a long rest. So by the time they get to say like the 2nd or 3rd episode, they're just depleted. And so I design everything based on that. Or if they're at like maximum hit points and resources, I find ways to deplete those resources. And also, just like you said, with the legendary actions, have everything around them affect it, and then use like 3-dimensional space to interact with that.
Yep.
So by the time and then also I actually go harder on the CR monsters than you should. So my minimum start for the D&D Beyond character generator is deathly, like deathly level.
Yeah.
And then I move up from that, because you can always take away from what that monster can do. So say you have an aboleth. Well, I'm like, I got a baby aboleth, that they can handle that. Or maybe it's so old, one of its tentacles has been cut off, so it can't actually do one of those things that it normally does. But being able to use things that way and get them to have used all their, healing potions, all their spell slots. And then I love to watch them make up for that. I've had only a couple tables get really upset, but those are like min-maxers. The other role players are just like, awesome. That monster just broke my weapon. I'm going to pick up this thing here and use that, and then start running away. And then having your monsters be able to move faster than the players. Oh man, it's so fun.
Well, awesome. I think we are out of time. I just want to take a moment real quick to say thank you to all 3 of you for taking the time out to come and chat and talk shop and share ridiculous stories with one another and all of that. Like that's why we play this game, right? Like that's why we're here. So if there's anything you'd like to shout out before we head out for the day, that would be great. Satine, we'll put you on deck.
Cool. I'm Satine Phoenix. You can find me at Satine Phoenix literally everywhere if it has anything to do with Dungeons and Dragons. I live and breathe. I'm a professional dungeon master. And also, I just started Satine's Quest. It's luxury travel gaming adventures. The next one is in May, and it is a 7-day cruise. So that's going to be fun. Thanks.
I'm Griffin McElroy. My Twitter handle is listed below, but I haven't tweeted myself in 3 years. So you can find all the shows we do at McElroy.family. We just started a new season of the Adventure Zone called Ether Sea. We're really, really proud of it. I think around the time this episode comes out is about the time our first episode of that season drops proper. So yeah, join it. And also we have a graphic novel coming out in a couple weeks,
Awesome.
which July 14th. It's an adaptation of our D&D campaign. And yeah, all the details and stuff are at McElroy.family.
Amazing.
Awesome. Thank you.
You can check me out, Sherlock_Hulmes, pretty much everywhere on the internet. But the main thing is my D&D show called HighRollers D&D. We've been going like 5 years now. We're based in the UK. We've done a bunch of stuff with Wizards of the Coast. Our main campaign is very homebrew. It's kind of like a sci-fi, fantasy, Final Fantasy, Star Warsy kind of mishmash. It's all very high-level, epic level stuff. It's very, very epic. Those are every Sunday on twitch.tv/HighRollersD&D. And it's, I think for you folks in the US, it's like 9 a.m. Pacific on a Sunday morning. What a lovely way to start your Sunday, with a cup of coffee and some British people playing Dungeons and Dragons. So come and check that out. I'm also the DM for Nights of Eveningstar here on the D&D on the D&D Twitch channel as well, which you can check out on Tuesdays, which it's midnight for UK times. I think it's 4 p.m. Pacific, with some very, very lovely people. And the other stuff you can find. Oh, and if you haven't checked it out, there's I wrote one of the adventures in Candlekeep Mysteries as well, which is called The Price of Beauty, and you can go and check that out. I was very pleased with it. So
thank you all so much for joining us, and we will see you the next time we get together a group of DMs to talk about cool stuff. So
Thank you very
thanks
much.
for joining
Thanks,
us.
Brandy.
Bye.
Bye, y'all.
Bye.
Bye.